I invite you to stand as you're able for the reading of the Gospel. The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 9th chapter. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. Peter, James, and John came down from the mountain after the transfiguration of Jesus, and we hear they kept this matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Sure, they kept it to themselves. Who were they going to tell? What would they even say? Yeah, you see, we went up the mountain with Jesus, and his clothes became brighter than anything ever, and his appearance was transformed, and Elijah and Moses showed up too, and then the voice of God spoke from a cloud. Wait, what? Why are you walking away? Of course they kept the matter to themselves. At the same time, though, we hear that they kept questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. And you might be questioning why they were even talking about this rising from the dead, since today's gospel doesn't even really talk about it. Well, that's why it's so crucial for us to know the context of Mark's gospel. That'll tell us precisely why Peter, James, and John were wrestling with resurrection questions. Right before our reading from chapter 9 today, there is chapter 8. Is that marvelous how that works? 8 comes before 9. In chapter 8, verse 27, Jesus asks his disciples 2 incredibly important questions. First, the warm-up. Who do people say that I am? And then the big one in verse 29. But who do you say that I am? And Peter gives the right answer. You are the Messiah. And then beginning in verse 31, Jesus explains just what it means that he is the Messiah, the Christ, the Savior. Mark writes, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." Then Jesus goes on to say, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." Well, now, this is basically the complete opposite of what folks wanted and expected. Prestige, status, power, wealth. Those were the things that were assumed to come with allegiance to the Messiah. And despite what some big-toothed televangelists say, Jesus offers none of those things. Instead, he talks of suffering, rejection, death, and resurrection, and invites his followers into the same. So it makes perfect sense then, as Peter, James, and John came down from the mountain, that they were questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. And even though we live on the other side of the resurrection, don't we often wonder the same thing? I mean, what does Jesus rising from the dead mean? And of course, for Jesus rising from the dead to mean anything, first, Jesus has to mean something to us. So who is Jesus? Why does it even matter? Now, it may seem silly for us to ask such seemingly basic questions. I mean, don't we all know who Jesus is and why he matters? I mean, we're here in church, aren't we? So we must already know the answers to these questions. Maybe. Maybe not. Last weekend, I mentioned that the church occupies a very different place in people's lives and in the larger culture today than it did generations ago. A couple generations ago, for example, being a Christian and being a part of a local church were taken for granted. It was just what people did. It was assumed that kids would go to Sunday school and confirmation. Families would show up on Sunday morning dressed up and sitting up straight. If you wanted to run for mayor, you had to be involved in your church. If you wanted the right clients, you went to church. It was a place to network and connect, a place to see and be seen. Good, bad, or indifferent, that is the way it was. But that's not the way it is anymore. You're here today because you want to be here. Well, except perhaps for some of you children and youth, you might be here against your wills. I get it. So let me correct myself. So by and large, you're here because you want to be here. You're not going to impress anybody by your church attendance or by your participation in a faith community. You know, that's actually a good thing. Because it's an exciting time to be the church, since this is a time of authenticity about a life of faith, since we're not doing it to impress anyone. It's countercultural to be involved in the church, and I really think that's the way it should be. Any ulterior motives are gone, and we're here today because there's something about this faith tradition, something about this story of God made known in Jesus Christ that compels us, that connects with us, that strengthens and empowers us. And since this is a time of authenticity, it's a time for us to be open and honest about our questions. We don't take Jesus for granted, so we ask, who is Jesus? Why does he matter? What does his rising from the dead mean? We ask those questions and we wrestle with how to respond to those questions too. And here's why this is so important today. NPR had a report on a new study that's been published about the faith lives of young people. And the finding of this new study that stood out to me the most was this. The average age when a young person begins to disaffiliate with her or his faith community is 13 years old. Now, this doesn't mean that they necessarily leave the faith at that age, but they have begun the process of leaving. Somehow mentally making plans to no longer associate with the faith. 13 years old. 13. Now, as the parent of a 12-year-old daughter and a 7-year-old son, this certainly caught my attention because I'm concerned about the faith lives of my children. Now, one typical response I've heard to these realities is for people inside the church to say, oh, that's just what young people will do. They'll wander away, but they'll come back once they have kids. And yeah, maybe that used to be true, but it's not really true anymore. Well, let me clarify. It still kind of happens here at Lord of Life to a large extent, but this is the exception. I've served in different churches and in different communities where it was no longer true that they would come back. And the research bears this out as well. It's one more thing for us not to take for granted. And it's a source of deep grief that I've heard from so many committed and faithful church members in so many different places. Their kids have grown up in the church, but now that they've grown up, they do not participate in a faith community. And now their grandkids aren't a part of the church either, and they're not learning about Jesus or participating in the church. And what I hear in this grief is people saying, but we did everything the church said we should do. We had our kids baptized and we brought them to Sunday school. They went through confirmation and high school youth group. They went on mission trips. We even encouraged them to go to a church college. But now they don't seem to care about the church or faith. What happened? If you ever feel that way, please know that you are not alone. And please know that hope is not lost. Now, in many ways, it feels as though the church has left the mountaintop of past generations, and now we've come down to the plains or even into the valley. Yet we can take heart with what we heard in Mark 9, verse 8. When Peter, James, and John came down from the mountain, we heard this. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. But only Jesus. Hope is not lost because Jesus is still with us. Jesus is still with you. Jesus is also with your kids and your grandkids, with your friends and family members who have left the faith, and even those who do not yet have faith. And so, how we respond to this reality that the church occupies a very different place today than in past generations is a big conversation with all sorts of moving parts. And it's a far bigger topic than could ever be covered in a single sermon. Just know that next week we'll pick up a different thread about this emerging reality. But for today, we can focus on the importance of asking our questions and wrestling with those questions from others and finding ways to offer our responses, to articulate our faith. And we can take heart that the questions we have echo the questions that Peter, James, and John had as they came down from the mountain. Who is Jesus? Why does he matter? What does his rising from the dead mean? Well, what I can offer today are my partial and incomplete answers. And I can offer my willingness to listen to your thoughts, your questions as well. So who is Jesus and why does he matter and what does his rising from the dead mean? Well, I experience Jesus as the fullest and clearest revelation of who God is. In some way that I can't fully explain, God put on our humanity as a Middle Eastern peasant a couple thousand years ago. God, the creator of the entire universe, chose to come among us and walk with us, to fully experience our human condition, to know us as closely and intimately as possible. I'm a Christian because our Christian story says that God does not remain aloof or at a distance, but God comes to us, which is why Jesus matters as he seeks to transform and restore us and our lives. Forgiveness of sin, justice for the oppressed, love for our neighbors, healing for the ill, and a deep relationship with God are all things Jesus brings. And Jesus rising from the dead means that God does something about the last enemy. God does something about the one reality that is inescapable: death itself. The resurrection of Jesus Christ robs death of its power, so we cannot be separated from the love of God. And this promise that God makes through Christ means there is life beyond this life for us, and there is another way to live this life. So we're not held captive by the death-dealing forces all around us. We are freed from thinking we need to earn God's love, and we can be secure in our everlasting life in Christ. Now, I can't argue anyone into having faith in Jesus, and I can't offer scientific proof of the resurrection. But I can live as though it's real and trust that despite my shortcomings and failures, God can use my life as a witness to Jesus Christ. And I can be willing to let my kids ask questions, and I can let them know what my questions are too. And we can be the church in a new way for this new day. And we meet people where they're at and ask questions with them, and we take nothing for granted. And we trust that Jesus Christ is right here with us, even when we're traveling down from the mountain. Amen.